Hi there, this is another in a series of videos accompanying the Joomla tutorial developing an MVC component, and in this step we're going to be looking at adding Ajax. These are the things I'm proposing to talk about during this video. So we'll start with this Ajax and Joomla overview. By the way, there is an interesting question on Stack Exchange: what is the proper way to make an Ajax call? So you may find that interesting after you've gone through the video and the tutorial. So if we look at Ajax, I'm kind of assuming that you have an idea about what Ajax is and that it's fairly familiar to you. But just to resume or give a quick resume, when a user clicks on a link on a page in a browser, the browser will initiate a call, an HTTP request to a server, and the server will then respond in the HTTP response with a page of HTML, which the browser will then take and display to the user. With an Ajax call, the user will click on an element, say, on that page, and that element will have a JavaScript listener associated with it. And that little JavaScript function will then initiate an Ajax request to the server, which is an ordinary HTTP request, except that it's got an XHR flag set. The server then takes that request. Usually it notices that it's an Ajax request, and rather than sending back a big page of HTML, it will usually send back a small bit of data, and we're going to be sending back that data in JSON format. That will come down in the HTTP response, which will get routed by the browser through to the JavaScript code again, and then that JavaScript code, usually what it does is updates a little bit of extra HTML on the page, and then the browser re-renders that page so that the user can see the updated page display. So we've kind of got three parts that we need to concern ourselves with. The first is the JavaScript listener, which listens on an element. In our case, it's going to be a button, and then initiates that request, that Ajax request, to the server. Then we've got server code over here to write, and we're going to be aligning with the MVC model. So we've got some controller, some view code, and some model code, which will handle that request. The response then will come back down, and we will again have some JavaScript code which will handle that response and update a little bit of HTML so that it can be displayed on the page. So we can have a look at that on the, here's that hello world page. Search here is going to initiate an Ajax request. And if we look at memory, I'm looking at XHR here. So this is our Ajax request. It has gone up and sent some stuff up to the server. It's got a response back down, and it's displayed that response on the page here. Okay, so let's go through our code and see what's going on. So if we start with our page, this is just our page here, and what we do is we've added this search here button, and we've added a couple of other things. We've added an area where we can put the search results, and we've also added the token, because security here is just as important as with normal web pages. So when we send the data up, we should be adding a token so that Joomla knows that the request has actually come from this code here. And again, usually whenever we output those tokens, we use kind of like JHTML_form.token, which will output this little element here. However, that usually gets sent to the server because it's part of a form. And when the form is submitted, all the stuff, all the elements, the input elements get sent up to the server. But here we don't have a form, so we need to be able to pick off this token and send it manually, as it were. And that's why we've used this format of it, so that we can label it with a particular ID, which will enable us in the JavaScript code to actually pick out that token. Here's our button, and it's got an on-click listener, which is search here. So if we go down to our JavaScript code, we just need to make this global now so that we can access the map outside that function there. And here's our search here function. We're getting the map bounds, and if you look at open layers, getting the latitude and longitude bounds of a map is a kind of like a two-stage process. You have to get the kind of like XY coordinates of the map, which is going to be in Mercator projection, and then you need to transform those coordinates using this function here from Mercator to the kind of latitude and longitude spherical sort of coordinate system. This may look a little strange to you, but really this is just a JavaScript object, so it's the same as this sort of thing down here. So you could equally put x equals this on one line, and on the next line return x. So there's nothing really complicated there. So we're back to our search here function. We got the bounds. We've now got the token. And we use jQuery extensively here, and particularly for the Ajax call, because it makes it all so easy. And you can find out more about the Ajax parameters and all that on the jQuery page there. This also you may find a little bit unusual. This is taking the value of that variable. So if we left out the square brackets there and just put token, we would get token equals 1 being sent up in the same way as it gets task equals map search. So when we look at that on our params, this is the value that token gets. And that's what we need in this case, rather than putting out token in the same way as task. So that's just that there. And we're sending task equals map search. So this is going to be the function that we're going to run in our controller. We're sending format equals JSON. And that's going to result in Joomla looking for a view.json.php file, and we're sending our map bounds. And then we have two things here. We have a success kind of leg, and if the Ajax request is successful, then it's going to call this function here, display search results, which is just down here. And if it's unsuccessful, it's just going to console.log there's an error, and then in the search results we're going to process those results and output those on the page just here. Okay, so let's look at our server code. And our server code, if we look at the difference between Joomla handling an ordinary HTML request or HTTP request and an Ajax request, well, routing to the controller is really handled the same as before, controller, view, model, and all that sort of stuff. So it's still based on option equals something. So that will route us through to our component. Task equals something will route us through to our function within the controller. Except that if it's set format equals something, then Joomla will look for the view in this view.xxx.php file. So we're sending format equals JSON. So it's going to expect the functionality in view.json.php. But in fact, that's really just the same as normal. It's usually just the case that we leave out format. And the default, if we leave it out, is HTML, which means that it's routed through to view.html.php, which is the usual case. In handling the AJAX request, we don't want any HTML output. We're just going to pass back some data. So there's going to be no layout file involved. There's no big template execution either. And Joomla looks after that side of things of no template execution. And we're going to be using JSON format to send that data back down. And there's a very useful Joomla class, which is JResponseJSON, and we're going to be looking at that in a bit more detail. So if we go to our server code, here's our controller within our function map search. And really it's just checking the token, and if the token doesn't match, it sends back an error message. Otherwise it continues on with the normal way of handling requests. To call display, and display then will result in the view, Joomla looking for the view in this file here, view.json.php, because the format equals JSON has been sent up. So this is our new file, and we're getting the map bounds here from the input parameters, and then we're calling a function on the model, passing the map bounds to get the records that actually fit those map bounds. Usually whenever we call a model function from the view, we call it in the form get, and then brackets, and then in double quotes, map search results, close brackets. But here we're wanting to pass a parameter to the model function, and we can't use that mechanism, that other mechanism, if we want to pass a parameter. So that's why we have to get the model and call the model function explicitly like that. And then we're, depending on the results sent back, we're setting up various JSON response class elements. And here's our model. And there's the new function, which is all fairly straightforward. We're just setting up a query on the database and passing back the response. So let's have a look at JSON response, and particularly this JResponseJSON class. This is really quite a good page, so it's actually worth reading this. And you see that the result of this JResponseJSON constructor, as it were, is this here. So this is the JSON encoded string that gets sent down to the to our browser based on the parameters that the constructor is called with. Now, I did try to find the API somewhere on the internet, but failed. So what I did was I just went into WordPad or Notepad++ and did a find in files and looked for class JResponseJSON and found where the source code was. And here we've got 4 parameters to this constructor, and that's the way that we've called it within our code here, called new JResponseJSON in various places. Here. And so on. So the 4 parameters are, first of all, the response. So this is really the data that you want sent down in the case that everything goes well. So in our case, the response is going to be the set of records which include the greeting and the latitude and longitude. And that then gets put into this field here, data. So whenever we look at our output here, response, this is what we're looking for here, data. So this is what we get in the case that everything goes well. The second parameter then is message. So if we want to output some sort of a message, and we had an example of that here, didn't get any records. So if it finds that there's no records, come back, and we can shift the map along here and do another search. And we see that it didn't get any message, didn't get any records. And if we look again at the response, need to change to get the second one there. This is our response. Our data is null in this case, and we've just got a message, didn't get any records. And that is because JSON, JResponse JSON has taken that second parameter and put it into here. Sorry, here. Right, so that's the messages parameter. The third parameter, this error parameter, and it's kind of a bit reverse logic. Error equals false is the default, which means that in that case, success will be set to true. So that affects this parameter here. So if we send the default into the constructor, we get success set to true. So in that previous example I had, didn't get any records, I sent true. I didn't send the default. Remember, the default is, go back here, default is false. So I set true into that, which meant it's true that there's an error, and that would have set success to be false. So that's what we got. Success is false. And the final parameter is ignore messages, and this means that the messages, if you call enqueue message, then that message gets put into the message queue. And whenever you call this JSON response thing, by default, those messages from that message queue go down, and I'll show you that in a couple of minutes. But if you want to ignore those messages so that they don't get sent down in the Ajax response, you would set true to that. So in this code, it's really just set to the default, and that will have the result of setting this here, messages, to be null. So these are the messages that will have been put into the message queue using enqueue message, and we'll see an example of that in a wee minute. Right, okay. Now, I wanted to show you another thing. Now, what I've done here is I've just opened within Notepad++ the live files. So these aren't the files from the kind of code base. They're the actual files that Joomla is interpreting. And they're pretty much the same as in the tutorial, except I've made a little change here in the success function, because I've output console.log type of result, comma, the result. And if we look at that in the console, you can see it's come back as object. Okay, and that's the object that is returned there. So if we look at our JavaScript code, what it's got here, it's display search results of this parameter result, and it's using this result as a JavaScript object. Okay. So what has happened is that whenever we have sent back the response payload is this down here, right? And this is really just a string of bytes. So what jQuery has done is it has taken that string of bytes and it has interpreted it as a JavaScript object. So whenever it has passed it to this function here, this result, jQuery, has actually given us a JavaScript object. And the reason it's done that is if we look in the headers, and yes, this has gone over it. Let me try and get rid of that. You can see there the content type has been set to application/JSON. So it does mean that what Joomla has done is that because we've used that JSON class, it is actually sent in the header of the response application/JSON, which meant that jQuery has recognized that and has actually given us a JavaScript object rather than just a string of bytes. Now, if we look at JSON response here, it says here that another advantage of using this class is that no apps close is necessary anymore. So if you do look through some stuff on the internet, you may well find that people, whenever they're writing Joomla code and they're using Ajax, they end the Ajax bit of code with closing the application, either using die or finding the app in the usual way, jfactory get application. And what they're saying is here is that if we do this JResponse JSON, we don't need to do that anymore. And what I find that it's not only unnecessary now, but it's also not advised now, because what I've got here is the controller. And what I'm going to do is just uncomment that there. So this is jfactory get application close. So you would see a lot of this in code on the internet based on Ajax for Joomla. I'm going to save that now. Joomla has actually, this is the live file, so when I run this now, it's going to run that file. And if we go back to the console, let's just clear that. And I'm going to click here. Right. And what we find is that it's come back as a string. Okay, and it's given us a problem there because it's a string. Now if I can't see it so well because it's a message, but if I move it back there where there should be messages and click again, it's got a string and it hasn't put anything out there. In fact, it's just left the previous message. And that's because if we look at the network for this message and we look at the content type text HTML, so the result of changing our code there to close the application meant that Joomla didn't get time to sort out the setting the right application content, and it's just left the content type as text HTML, which is probably the default, which means it's mucked us up. So that's just something to be aware of. Very often when you're looking at the console and you output something like, as I say, I've got this here, which is console.log of the result, and it logs this, and you think, oh, that's a nice JavaScript object, but it's not. It's actually just a string. It's not an object. So when you start doing things like this on it, you're going to find problems. Okay. Now the second thing I wanted to highlight here is that we've got a success here and we've got a success here. And really those are two different things. So this first success on this line is kind of like the jQuery success, which gets set and called depending on whether the Ajax request was successful or failed. So what I'm just going to do is go into our code, hello world in, no, it's on media, components, hello world, use hello world. Here we are. So here's our two views we've got. And I'm just going to take this one and I'm going to rename it. Okay. And we're going to call this again. Let's close that. Right. And Ajax called failed. So what happened, and if we look at the network, we'll see more detail, that a 500 response was sent back, which is a server error. So what has happened is that Joomla has tried to open the view.json.php file. It's obviously been renamed, so it's not there any longer. It didn't find it. Just put it back. And as a result, Joomla has sent back a 500 status code on the HTTP, which then has come back into jQuery's Ajax, and it's taken us down this route here of the error function. Okay, so let's look at some of the other errors you can find. Well, if we go to our controller, let me put this back on here. We're checking a token, and if we change that get to post, what will happen is that we'll look for the token in a post, HTTP post, but in the Ajax query, we're actually sending an HTTP get, so we shouldn't actually get that token there. So let's see what happens whenever we fire that up. Okay, now in this case, it's come through okay. The Ajax request has been completed okay. So from a jQuery point of view, it is successful. So it has gone down this route here, success, display search results. But as you can see, what it sent back is success equals false, message error invalid token, which is the one that we sent in our controller. So that is how that error message gets through there. And then just in our JavaScript code, we've checked result success. If it's not success, we pick up that message and output it. So that's that. Let me just change that back again. And then let's go to our model. And what I'm going to do is just change a bit of the SQL so that it gives me a SQL error. I'm going to change that. And then I'm going to do that. Okay. So we've got two messages here. Didn't get any records. And that didn't get any records has come from our view file here. Didn't get any records, there are no records sent back. But also what has happened here, we've sent no records back. It's come down this exception route because this is raised an exception. But I've also sent an enqueue message here, which is the error message which is associated with the exception. And in the JavaScript code, it's looked at those messages and then picked off those messages and output those as well. So if we look at the contents response payload, let's get the right one here, this one here. So this is what we've got back. We've got success equals false. We've got didn't get any records, which is the message output by the view. And then we've got this error message here, which is the error message that has come in the exception, and in the model code we've used enqueue message to put that into the message queue, and then JResponse JSON has picked it out of the message queue and sent it back down in the Ajax response. So hopefully that's clear. Let me just change this back again. Okay. So we've covered really all of these things here, looking through the code, both in the happy path and in the case of error handling. Now, if you've been trying out debugging, you'll find that being able to debug with a symbolic debugger, a Joomla application, can be very useful. Now I use Eclipse, and I've got Eclipse here, and I'll just refresh this to make sure I've just got the latest copy. I did actually do a little video on how to set up Eclipse and put it on this Joomla page if you're interested. But one of the things that is very useful is to be able to debug Ajax requests, and sometimes it's actually a bit tricky to actually catch them. So if we look at how the move this a bit. How the debug works with Eclipse and XDebug. So we've got XDebug, which is incorporated within our server code. So if you look at the that video, you understand how to set up XDebug on the server code. Then Eclipse sends an HTTP request in the normal way to the server code, and then XDebug picks that up and starts trying to contact Eclipse on port 9000. So it tries to set up a session between XDebug and Eclipse, which is kind of like a management session, and this is the way that Eclipse can control stepping through the code, seeing variables and all those sorts of things. Is via that sort of like control path, and this is like the data path. So how is it that whenever we have an ordinary browser and we kind of contact the server, why is the XDebug not kind of kick in there? So if we look at the XDebug documentation, and I'll put this link on the video. To start up, if you want to debug a script started through a web browser, simply add XDebug session start equals session name as a parameter to the URL. So if we go back to Eclipse, and I've set some of these up, hello world site, and if we look at, this is just stopped at the first line of code within the Joomla. If we look at the request parameters, you see XDebug session start Eclipse dbgp. So Eclipse has actually sent that as part of the URL in its HTTP request down here, and XDebug has seen that, and then XDebug has tried to open a TCP session on this port, and this is where Eclipse should normally be listening. On our browser, we wouldn't usually send this parameter here as part of the URL, so XDebug really just stays out of the way there, and it just lets the PHP code get on with itself. So the same sort of thing has to happen if we want to debug an Ajax request, and if you're using an IDE other than Eclipse, what you maybe need to do is send that same parameter to the debug there. So for example, I've put this into the code here. Sending something like XDebug session start here as parameters, so that we'll say Debug will actually pick those out and recognize that it needs to run the debugger in that case. So for example, if we go back to Eclipse, now, I have found that Eclipse doesn't always work with this code. You can see that the map there isn't displayed, and I think it's because what I'm using here is the ordinary kind of internal browser. So search here doesn't kind of do much there. So what I'm going to do is stop that and go Window Preferences and go General Web Browser and use an external browser and use Firefox. Okay, so I'm going to do that. So now when I debug the site, what will happen is that it will start off a Firefox browser tab here, which is just hanging because it's come back into Eclipse here. And I'm just going to let that progress. And on Firefox, I'm going to hello world. The world again, that's going to go into XDebug, and XDebug is going to be waiting and will contact Eclipse. And what I've done is I've set a couple of breakpoints here in my controller code. So whenever I click here, search, and once again, it's gone into Eclipse. So if I run on here, it's going to stop in my controller code here. And then I can actually go ahead and continue with stepping through or whatever, and basically have all the ability to debug the Ajax request. Now obviously this line here in my code is commented out, so I'm not actually sending anything like that to the server, but the way that it has worked here is that if we look at, one way is to add this session or through a cookie named XDebug session there. So if I look at storage here and go down to cookies, there's my XDebug session cookie there, set to Eclipse dbgp. So in this sort of way, you can still get a debugger to work on your Ajax calls. If you're not using Eclipse, but you are using XDebug, then you would have to look at your own IDE and work out, well, how can I either use an external browser which will save the cookies, or I could maybe change the code here to put in a particular parameter so that XDebug will be invoked. Okay, so that's that. The final thing was really just to suggest if you wanted to try anything else. if I go back here and install this, it's down a bit. I wonder, is that going through debug as well? Because it's Joomla, it's debugging everything. Yes, because the cookie is kind of like across all the tabs. It'll get sent for all of these cases. Go on hello world. Search here. Right. I was hoping that that would actually show the. Oh, it's probably the JavaScript hasn't been updated. That's it now, yes. Sorry, what I hadn't done there is hadn't pressed Shift to reload. And if I don't press Shift while I'm hitting the reload key, it can sometimes just use the JavaScript that's in the browser cache. So if I do Shift reload, it means it'll bring down the new JavaScript. And you can actually put on the kind of like the annotations onto the map. So that's something else you might want to try. If you're using Google Maps, then there is a different way to get the longitude and latitude of a map. So this Stack Overflow question here will help you. The other suggestion is that in this case we've started with a map and gone to the hello world messages. The alternative is to start with the whole hello world messages and then make the user select one of the hello world messages and then bring down that using Ajax, bring down the kind of coordinates of that message to then display the map, kind of doing it from the messages first and then display the map. And if you're really feeling ambitious, you could do the same sort of thing as Google does, so that whenever Google, when I type a key, it does an Ajax request and automatically comes back with lots of suggestions here. So whenever you have a box here, you can type a key and it can go off and search for hello world messages where the greeting matches what someone has typed in, and you can gradually whittle down the number of messages, and then whenever someone has selected them, you can display the map. So that's another suggestion if you want to try something which is a bit more challenging. And the best of luck with that. Thanks for watching. Bye.